Hi, everybody. So we're going to start the Vasculitis Patient Powder Research Network guided tour, poster gallery guided tour. Thank you all of you for joining us today and for staying on for this. This is we're going to talk about this will be a guided tour of the research poster gallery presented to you by the Vasculitis Patient Powered Research Network. We've broken up the guided tour to three parts. So we'll start off with a brief introduction, and then we'll go through the guided tour, and we'll walk through some of the research posters of the VPPRN. We'll visit each of the posters, provide a brief synopsis of each, and explain the importance of each to patients. Then we'll close with a audience Q&A, time permitting. But before we begin, we want to go over some quick housekeeping notes. We are recording this session, so this is something that you can rewatch at a later time, or it's available to individuals who couldn't participate live, and they can watch at a later date on demand as well. And for the questions and answer or questions from the audience, please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and submit your questions through there. And hopefully we'll have time to answer all the questions at the end of the tour. And that's it in terms of housekeeping notes. So I'm going to introduce our tour guide for today is Dr. Michael Putman. Dr. Michael Putman is an assistant professor of medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin, where he serves as the Associate Fellowship Program Director and the Medical Director of the Vasculitis Program. He is also involved in medical education and is the co-director of the Hematology Immunology block. From a research perspective, he conducts meta-research and studies giant cell arteritis on a Rheumatology Research Foundation scientist development grant. In his spare time, he hosts the Evidence-Based Rheumatology podcast and is an associate editor of the journal Rheumatology. So welcome, Dr. Putman. Thank you for being our tour guide for today.
Everybody, thanks so much for having me.
We're excited to have you. But before we begin, we want to just talk about, what research posters are. Let's put it into context. So if you can just, talk about what is a research poster, why is it important, and where does this fit in the life cycle of a research study?
Those are all great questions. So a research poster is a condensed and visual form of a research project. So the idea is that, it's a little bit light on the text typically, so you don't have to read the 3,000 word manuscript to get the gist. And it should have engaging visuals, which most of our posters today have just really, really well done work where you see some charts or some figures or some tables that bring together all the relevant information readily understandable format. So that's what a research poster is. And as far as its role, I think there's three main roles for a research poster. The first one is science communication, which I think is really important. Posters help us share scientific information in a way that is quick and efficient and allows patients and other folks to really get a lot of this valuable information. The second one is feedback. I have gotten a lot of great feedback over the years from abstracts and posters that I've shared. Often someone will come and be somewhat critical and they'll say, hey, you should have done this better. And say, you're right. And then you have time to go back and fix that. And the third thing I think is really outreach. I think that posters are a way to get early stage investigators to be able to showcase their work and get to meet people. So standing next to my poster, and I've had big wigs and vasculitis come by to say hello. And so it's an opportunity to just say, hey, I'm here, and to kind of get some practice talking about scientific research with folks. So that's kind of the roles of posters. And then I think you asked about the life cycle. Is that the last question?
Yeah. Where's a research poster sort of fit in the life cycle of a research study?
Yeah, I think research posters is like the toddler phase, So, you've got teeth, you can run around, but, you haven't figured out long division yet. It's early on. Typically, posters are done before the project is finalized. Almost by definition, you're not supposed to submit posters to most meetings if they've been published. So they have to be before publication. But my preference is also that posters be somewhat close to a finished product. More recently, I'd say I've been violating my own rules, and I've been submitting posters that I say, oh, I feel good about this, but I know there's more to do. And so I think of it as like early on in the life phase where there's probably going to be some changes before the final publication, but you should have the gist of it. And in broad strokes, it should reflect what's ultimately published.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
providing that context. So I think we're ready to start the tour. So Dr. Plumman, if you want to share your screen, walk us through the poster gallery. So the poster gallery has about 7 posters. They were all sort of presented at the Vasculitis and ANCA workshop earlier this year. So so go ahead. Let's play.
Sounds great. All right. So are any of the folks who did the posters themselves here? Because I don't want to step on toes if anyone's here to present their own work.
No, they are not.
Excellent. All right. Well, they were wonderful and provided me with some bios and information beforehand. So I will be in good shape to present them. All right. So this is our first poster. This is entitled Preferences Regarding the Treatment with Plasma Exchange for ANCA-Associated Vasculitis, an International Patient Survey. This was by Dr. David Collister, who is trying to learn Mandarin during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that's kind of a cool skill. And this project is, like I said, about patient preferences for the treatment of ANCA vasculitis with plasma exchange. I think this is a fascinating topic. Plasma exchange has been very interesting. In the past couple of years, I think a lot of physicians have been changing the way they approach this in the wake of the PEXA-VASH trial. That was a large randomized trial that looked at either doing plasma exchange or not doing plasma exchange among patients who had severe ANCA vasculitis. In particular, for those with renal disease, we thought that there was probably a strong role for this. And ultimately, the trial did not support the use of plasma exchange for most patients. I think there's some caveats there, and some subsequent work has suggested that perhaps with those who have sicker kidneys, plasma exchange still has a role. And so I think that this is a moving target, and I think this poster highlights a lot of that. So their aim was to elicit the patient's preferences for what to do with plasma exchange in ANCA vasculitis. And so this is a nice little introduction to what posters look like. They have a little background, and they say the objective, and they tell you what they did and how they did it. And so in this case, they had some patient partners who were involved, which is fantastic. I think we're all doing a better job of that recently, and I love having patient partners as part of my projects. I think it really helps bring out some things that you wouldn't have known or thought of otherwise. And they circulated a survey to people, and one thing that's kind of neat that they did here is they presented the patients with 5 scenarios, and they sort of subtly changed the things in the scenarios. And then they asked them whether the patient would be interested in receiving a plasma exchange. So there's some fancy modeling and regression analyses they did, but I think that the data stands for itself. Really an impressive study. You know, they sent out 13,000 emails, which sort of tells you sort of the power of the VPPRN. And this is the kind of thing that a physician never would have been able to do by themselves, right? And so being able to leverage a patient-powered network like this opens up all kind of research opportunities that would not have otherwise been available. And I think that's going to be a consistent theme throughout these projects. And so what they saw, they got 700 respondents, and of people who were eligible, ultimately 470 had complete data and could be included. And pretty interesting, they found that a large number of patients would consistently choose plasma exchange, so about a third. About 1 in 5 would decline plasma exchange across all scenarios. And then there's this middle ground, which is what you often see, where it sort of depends on the scenario and depends on the person. And I think that that's really interesting, and that kind of reflects my clinical practice, where some people have a preference for action, almost no matter what. Some people have a preference for non-intervention, which I think is often appropriate. And then a lot of people are open to talking through the risks and the benefits and trying to really understand the options before them. And so that kind of gets to the conclusions of the authors for this paper. And they emphasize the importance of shared decision-making for the decision to pursue plasma exchange, which I think that makes a lot of sense. For some patients, this will be a really important therapy to consider. And for others, it's probably not quite as either necessary or indicated, depending on the clinical scenario. For those who don't know what plasma exchange is, that's where I always say we're trying to get rid of the malhumors. We place a large bore IV and we exchange all of the proteins that may be causing the inflammatory disease. with proteins that are hopefully happy and aren't causing any issues like that. And so it is a somewhat invasive procedure because you need to put in a large IV and then you need to swap out all these proteins, but it's overall well tolerated. And we think that for people with renal disease, there may be a role for it. So their conclusions over here, they sort of highlight what I said about the different groups of people. They looked at the predictors, so what would make someone inclined to go for it or not, and they highlight a couple interesting things such as previously receiving dialysis, previously receiving plasma exchange, which all kind of makes sense. And then they pointed out just that I think shared decision making is very important here. So very, very cool project, and the one that I really enjoyed this poster, and I thought it was a pretty interesting one. So thank you to Dr. Collister and Dr. Walsh for putting it together. All right, Christine, do I just go to the next one?
Yes, please.
All right, great. So we'll just jump to number 2. Where's number 2 run off to? Here's number 2. So this is another exciting study. This was done by Dr. Tiffany Daria, who is a third-year internal medicine resident at the University of Pennsylvania. I am always so excited when I see residents presenting work. I put a lot of effort into trying to get my own residents in my own program to be interested in rheumatology, and making sure that they have opportunities for research is always especially important. So excellent, Dr. Daria. We're very excited that you're interested in the field of rheumatology. Dr. Daria is also a very interesting person. She's seen all of the 7 wonders of the world. I don't even know if I've seen one of them. So I think she has me beat by at least 7 right now. There was a patient partner who's involved in this project as well, Dr. Jennifer Gordon, PhD. And this project is entitled Trends in Medication Interruptions and Anxiety During the COVID-19 Pandemic, an online survey of patients with vasculitis. This is a very topical presentation. And this is something that I've thought about a lot. I've done some work in COVID-19 and patient, fellow, physician experiences through the Global Rheumatology Alliance, which is a big group that does somewhat similar work. But this is great because the VPPRN participate in this as well. And then that way you actually get a large sample of people with vasculitis. And I think during COVID-19, something that I talk about almost every day in my clinics is anxiety over COVID, which is very justifiable. And it's been a really big challenge. I think a lot of patients' lives have really been derailed by the pandemic. A lot of the patients who we have are immunosuppressed. They're taking some of the immunosuppressions that are of particular concern with regard to COVID-19. And I think that this has been a sort of a consistent theme for rheumatologists and mostly for rheumatology patients. So what Dr. Daria did was they looked to identify trends in anxiety among patients, and then critically, how that could affect medication usage during the pandemic. Again, this was through the Vasculitis Patient Powered Research Network and some partnering organizations. And this is neat because this was a 52-week study. So it wasn't just a one-off. They evaluated at 2 different time points, which is great. So they did baseline surveys in 2020 from March to June, and they did a follow-up survey in May of 2021, which I think gives us this study a little extra juice. You could ask at one point, and then your question is always compared to what, right? But in this case, they asked at 2 different points, and so that gives you an interesting comparison, especially because so much has changed over that year of the pandemic. So I thought that was a very powerful thing that they did. Took a lot more work, took a lot more time, but kudos to them for making that extra effort. So they collected a lot of important variables, and they looked at anxiety scores and medication usage across that time period. So again, down the bottom here, you can see they had a very large sample of patients. Ultimately, they had 535, and their ages reflected what you expect among patients with vasculitis. 30 people on rituximab, which is one of the medications, of course, that we've had some concern with regard to COVID-19. 42% were on glucocorticoids. So these are folks who are definitely taking medications that would, be associated with anxiety, but are also probably medications that are very important to be taking, which is, makes things challenging. And then what they did is they looked in these anxiety scores over time, which is really neat. And it's also really sad because you can see how high the PROMIS anxiety scores were. But encouragingly, and I think this probably reflects the world at large, over time, the anxiety scores started to trend down a little bit as we got vaccinations. Right around January of 2021 is when we first started getting high quality, highly effective vaccinations, which I think were probably quite helpful. At that point, I think a lot of people had COVID-19 as well. And so perhaps their anxiety over it was less once they had experienced it. And then finally, we had a lot of information. We knew a lot more about which risk factors mattered and We knew a lot more about which medications were problematic and how things were going for our patients. And, I think that on the one hand, some of that news was certainly concerning, which is that COVID-19 was a very scary pandemic. But some of it was encouraging in the sense that, once we had good vaccinations, outcomes improved. We have Evishield, we have all these other treatments that we've been using, I think have helped, especially more recently. So, the results they said that the patients were more likely to be worried about getting sick in 2020 versus 2021. And there were more medication interruptions in 2020 instead of 2021. But there's some interesting facts about these medication interruptions. So if you look down here at table 2, you can see a lot of this was physicians telling the patients to stop it. So a lot of those were probably, either very appropriate or medically indicated. And then some of them were about patients being worried about being sick. And I would say these are also appropriate. If you're on a medication and you're worried about COVID-19, it's your medication. And so I always, throughout the pandemic, I've tried to very much defer to my patients' preferences for risk tolerance. There's some people for whom high dose immunosuppression is very much indicated, and I will strongly encourage that. But at the end of the day, it's always shared decision making, and I think there should be a very wide latitude for trying to chart the course for each individual person. So their conclusions, they said anxiety levels were high at the start of the pandemic and decreased through mid 2021. There were medications, but these were often reflected, perhaps vaccination as well as a big reason, and then concerns about the pandemic. They said that they need to work on measures to prevent unnecessary medication interruptions, which I think this is just all about relationship. You need to be available and you need to be able to talk to people. I think that's availability is the key there. So very cool poster by a third year medical resident. Thank you, Dr. Daria. Stop shuffling things. Thank you. So their next poster, number 3, is by Dr. Tanaz Kamani, who is a rheumatologist at UCLA. And Dr. Kamani worked with Diane Shaw, who's the patient partner for this project, which is entitled Clinical Characteristics and Reliability of a Self-Reported Diagnosis of Large Vessel Vasculitis. This is a very cool topic, and this is something that I think is critically important. There's going to be another poster about that in a minute here. But Dr. Kamani, just before I go on, I want to share her fun fact, which is that she's obsessed with all things Harry Potter, which I think many of us probably are. So, like I said, the goal of this was to determine the reliability of self-reported diagnosis of GCA or Takayasu's. And this is an interesting poster to present to a patient audience, because I'm sure all the patients there are saying, of course, my diagnosis is reliable because I'm telling you that's my diagnosis. And I think that the framing for this that's really important is that, for research studies, there's a high bar for determining whether or not someone has a diagnosis. So even when physicians assign diagnoses in research studies, we say, are you sure about that? And we often require that you meet a number of criteria for disease. And so I think that it's very important with rare diseases like vasculitis that we are able to say, if we can survey patients, we can tell you that if we ask patients that they are often very good at saying that they have this disease, and they're often totally correct. And so that was the goal of this paper. It was to validate this method of finding patients with diseases. And so what Dr. Kamani and their group did is they looked for patients with giant cell arteritis and Takayasu. I'll scroll in here on the methods. They looked at patients with giant cell arteritis and Takayasu who were enrolled in the VPPRN. And they had participants provide them demographic information, a number of background information about the disease. And then they asked a critical question, which is what proportion of these patients met the ACR criteria for giant cell arteritis or Takayasu, or the 2012 Chapel Hill consensus definitions. So what they found is that among this cohort, 3/4 had GCA on reported diagnosis by biopsy, and 87% with Takayasu had diagnosis by imaging, which is typical. And then they found that 90% of the patients with giant cell arteritis or Takayasu met the ACR classification criteria, which is a very high number. I think that's much better than most doctors get when if you looked at their own panels. So this is the group of people that they were looking at. The age was about as you'd expect. Takayasu patients were much younger, mostly female, and they had a number of symptoms that you would expect with those diseases. The treatments for these folks were about what you'd expect as well. A lot of people were on steroids, more methotrexate in the Takayasu group, and more TNF therapy, TNF inhibitors, which you would expect. More tocilizumab in the giant cell arteritis group, which you would expect. And then this is the critical table, which they showed that the people in this cohort who had self-reported having giant cell arteritis, 87% met classification criteria for giant cell arteritis, and for Takayasu is 95%. So that's very good fidelity, in my opinion, where, and this is really important from a research perspective because it tells you that you could survey patients and say, do you have giant cell arteritis or Takayasu? And the patients who say, yes, I have that, would meet criteria. And therefore, this is a very valid way to perhaps find people for subsequent studies. So their conclusions, they said this is a rare disease, which we all know, but patients who have this disease are reliably providing information that you need to include them in studies. They said that, the manifestations that we saw, and this is kind of like an internal check, right? To say, okay, so people who had these diseases, did they have the things we'd expect? They said, yes, you had the symptoms that we would expect, the medications that we would expect. So there's a pretty high fidelity, and this means that it's probably feasible to use these patient-powered research networks for research purposes, which is just very, very useful. And I think it's very important for the field going forward. So this was work by Dr. Tanaz Kermani using the VPPRN. All right, we'll move on to number 4, and I'm going to continue to try not to make too much noise and continue to try to remember to zoom in. So this next project was by Dr. Robert Nicoletti with a VPPRN research partner. It's not listed on my sheet here, but I believe it's probably listed here. Anyways, with the patient partner as well from the VPPRN. The title of this one, and Dr. Nicoletti has been coaching his daughter's baseball team this spring, which is a fun fact. But the title of this one is Quality of Life Impact of Cutaneous Vasculitis, Findings from the VASC Skin Study and the Vasculitis Patient-Powered Research Network. So I think this is a fantastic topic. And I think this is a really interesting area because skin findings are one of those things that physicians don't get terribly worked up about. We see skin findings and we say, okay, it's a skin finding. At least it's not X other organ that makes me terrified. But this really matters to patients. And I think this is a cool project because they said, well, let's look and see how much this matters as far as quality of life is concerned. And so, they said the study here, the goal was to assess quality of life for patients with cutaneous manifestations of vasculitis and look at factors affecting the patient's experience. So again, this is a study that was a survey that went through the VPPRN, and they looked at people with cutaneous manifestations of vasculitis. So that's the group of interest. They sent this short form health survey, the SF36. We call this a patient-reported outcome measure. It's one of the most common, most widely used ways of asking the question, how good is your quality of life right now? It's well evaluated, used in all sorts of studies. And they also asked the effects of skin disease on quality of life. They have a specific index for skin disease, which is interesting. So they got 234 responses, again, a very large number. Cut that down to 190 once they got rid of the duplicates and everything. And then they looked at the differences between quality outcome measures, and they measured these quality outcome measures for people across various domains of those. So this is a really nice little chart here. And so this is the quality of life as measured by the SF36 and by the skin index. And you can see in the skin index, there's a lot of different domains of these indices. So there's an emotional domain, a symptomatic domain, a functioning domain, and then an overall domain. And you can see these color codes kind of tell you which disease people had. So for people with cutaneous small vessel vasculitis, IgA vasculitis, and then urticarial vasculitis, you saw pretty high scores on these quality of life domains. Lower scores with people who had microscopic polyangiitis and EGPA, which I think is probably what you would expect if you're just sort of guessing beforehand what you would expect to see. And then looking just across the SF36, you see pretty high scores on these SF36 sort of across the board in a variety of domains, which is a very important and consequential finding in my opinion. Here's the characteristics of the patients who were included. And then they actually did some statistical testing to sort of compare which of these were different comparing between men and women, disease severity, severe, or either mild or severe, and then duration, so 2 years or under 2 years or over 2 years. And they saw some important statistically significant differences in a number of these. So their conclusions were that administration of a validated skin-specific health surveys showed a lot of diminished quality of life across a number of different domains. This jives with my clinical experience, which is that skin findings and skin disease are very important for quality of life. They said skin-limited cutaneous small vessel vasculitis had a quality of life impact which met or exceeded the severity observed in other vasculitides, which is really kind of a crazy thing when you think about it from a physician's perspective. Because a physician, you'd say, well, your lowest quality of life would be someone who had, involvement with their lungs. But this is saying that, skin is, just as bad for your quality of life. And it's really interesting. I would have kind of expected this because if you look at psoriasis research in particular, psoriasis is not even, psoriasis is a disease where we actually have very good medications to cure the psoriasis. Quality of life goes up a lot when you fix someone's psoriasis, a lot. All those psoriasis medications have a dramatic impact on quality of life. And so I just think this is a really interesting paper, both for one, because this kind of jives with what I would expect, which is that quality of life is incredibly important for patients. And it sort of shows that this is true across different types of vasculitis, but skin vasculitis in particular has a low quality or has a big impact on quality of life. So good information for folks who are suffering with that. All right, so moving. Yeah.
So we only have a couple more minutes. Do you want to choose just one more poster to go through? One of your favorite
of
the
no,
last?
Sorry,
yeah,
so
no.
I
know. You're so into it.
All right.
Yeah.
So let me give a couple. Yeah. So let me just touch base on two, and then I'll do one more. I promise.
Thank you.
So this one I think is really important by Dr. Springer. This is the similar thing to the one that I talked about with Dr. Kermani, where they were saying, we're going to see if people who self-report PAN also met criteria for polyarteritis nodosa. And similarly, they saw a very high rate, 95%. And so I think that those two posters are really nice validation work showing that VPPRN is a great tool for doing research and that patients identifying themselves as having these diseases has a high fidelity. I thought it was a really cool study. It was looking at relapses and how much people are interested in avoiding relapses. Very important question. What kind of reduction would you care about to avoid a relapse? And they found that most people, for an absolute risk of relapse reduction of 5%, would accept an additional therapy, which told me on the one hand, people are very willing to try new therapies. Makes me a little nervous. We need to kind of balance the risks on both sides. But I think that also speaks to how serious some of the vasculitis can be, where people will be willing to start another treatment for just a 5% risk. But the one that if I have one more to highlight, I want to highlight this one because I think it's just such a neat topic and very well displayed visually. Dr. Quinn this research group has a knack for doing that. So this paper by Dr. Quinn is entitled "An International Delphi Exercise to Identify Items of Importance for Measuring Response in ANCA-Associated Vasculitis." Dr. Quinn played soccer in high school, and her team won the Connecticut State Championship, which is kind of cool. But so for background here, they're saying current outcome measures have limitations. Physician-based ones don't incorporate patient perspectives. BVAS, this is the Birmingham Vasculitis Activity Score. This is what we use in trials mostly. Is not linear. It's not fully scalable. So there's a lot of issues with using that. And so they said, we need to start incorporating self-assessment into outcome measures, which matters a lot to me. And so I just think this is a great topic. And so they did a 3-round Delphi exercise, which is this protocolized way of getting people to agree on things. You send them a survey, they respond, and it comes back, and you put your heads together, then you try it again. And so you do these rounds to try and come to consensus. Physicians with expertise in ANCA vasculitis were included, and patients with ANCA vasculitis were included, which gives you this really cool ability to compare what patients and what physicians thought was most important. So I very interesting. I love studies like this that highlight just how important it is to understand patient and physician perspective, because they often differ. So they asked people to rate the importance of each item when assessing response in a trial of vasculitis. And this is just a beautiful graph. So let me orient you here. So the bubble sizes reflects the precision of each item. So a bigger bubble means they're more confident that this is where the answer is. Blue circles show that greater than 70% of patients rate the item as highly important. So you see this blue circle here, pain, fatigue, these are very important for the patient perspective. Red circles show that physicians rated this highly, and green circles show that physicians rated this item highly. So it's kind of interesting. If you look at this chart, so with respect to patient-reported outcomes, they said, what patient-reported outcomes did patients and physicians agree on? So it looked like they all agreed that health-related quality of life and patient global assessment was very important. We've seen this blue circle. So a lot of patients highly rated pain and fatigue as an important outcome measure, which that really jives with my experience. I mean, I think patients are always concerned about fatigue. It's such a hard symptom for physicians. And so I think some people sort of stray away from it, but we shouldn't, because this is very, very important for patients' quality of life. And the next one is disease activity measures. So remember, these green circles indicate that a lot of people both rated an item as highly important. Everyone agreed survival is important. Everyone agreed that not developing end-stage renal disease is important. Everyone agreed that you don't want major organs involved. And everyone agreed that physician global assessment was important, although there was a little less consensus. That small bubble means that, the people's answers were a little bit all over the place. But then this is really interesting. So the red circles, remember, indicate physicians rated this as highly important, and the blue circles mean that patients did. And so they're small circles, so there wasn't a high degree of confidence in this. And you can see where the physicians and patients are kind of diverging in what outcome or disease activity measure they thought would be important in a clinical trial. And so blue is the patients. So patients thought that proteinuria, hematuria, and inflammatory markers were important. And the physicians really cared about these BVAS changes and discontinued dialysis, which I think patients would agree with that too. And so I thought that was really interesting and kind of a neat way to graphically display the data. Their conclusion was that there was consensus on many items, and you can see those. There are these big green ones. Everyone agrees, and we all agree would feel about the same about it. There were some differences, though, where physicians seem to like these disease activity measures. It's like BVAS, kind of esoteric stuff. Patients care more about patient-reported outcome measures, like fatigue and pain, and they care more about these laboratory measures. I think a lot of doctors sort of poo-poo this because we don't like to get too hung up on numbers, but I think for patients, it's a very tangible way to conceptualize how your disease is going. And so I learned a lot from this paper, just thinking, my patients probably think about their proteinuria levels much more than I rate them as far as an outcome measure is concerned. And so this will be, important for the next steps of response criteria for clinical trials, which I think is really cool. And I just really enjoyed the way of displaying that data, which is always hard. You can imagine someone just making a big table that would be really hard to understand. But I thought this was really a creative way to go about it. All right, so I apologize for running over, but I always get kind of excited to talk about things. And that concludes the poster show. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, we had some good questions in the coming into the chat. So I didn't know if you had a chance to take a look at that. We have a question from Sarah Jones, who was talking about, I'm assuming the Dr. Quinn study, looking at who possibly funded this. I think that was a question that she had asked about it. I know with Dr. Quinn's study, there were multiple sort of partnering organizations that assisted with that study. So that's also in the poster as well. I think it's ACR, EULAR, OMERACT, and the VPPRN. There's a question regarding from Anna. She said, so my question is probably geared for another session, but I like to ask it anyway.
Sounds good.
My diagnosis presents questions because aspects of diagnosis are confusing and raise many questions. This current presentation is relevant. How can a patient pair up with a researcher to investigate further? Primary care, rheumatologists, dermatologists are too busy to do this. And she talked about connecting with a vasculitis fellow or getting a health and wellness coach. So any sort of insight that you can provide regarding that question about pairing up with a researcher to investigate further?
That's a great question. I'll tell you, this goes both ways. I was recently, I'm actively working on a project right now. We're doing a big epidemiology assessment of post-COVID vaccination, whether people develop new rheumatic diseases or new inflammatory syndromes. I think it's very important that we say whether or not that's happening and to what degree, if it is. But I talked about it online on the Twitters, and of course it got viral and a lot of people had strong opinions. And I said, well, I could either delete my Twitter account, which is what I wanted to do, or I could reach out to some people and find some patient partners. And so I reached out to some of the people who were quite upset at me and brought one of them on to be part of the project. And so now we have a patient partner who is part of the research project, and she's given some really valuable feedback. She said, you should have thought about this disease because the patient community really cares about this thing that's happening. And I said, we hadn't thought about that. We're not connected to that community the way you are. And so I thought that was really helpful. But I would suffice it to say, I have trouble finding patient partners sometimes too for specific questions. It would be kind of interesting if if some sort of foundation, which had resources and infrastructure, could put together sort of a listserv to connect people. Because I think that there's probably a lot of folks who would love to participate in research and would have valuable things to contribute. And there's probably a lot of physicians who are doing a project and say, hey, I wish I had someone, with, urticarial vasculitis who happen to have some weird complication, and I'd like to have them be part of this project. I mean, I think that there's probably some role for connecting people better, and perhaps the VF could play a role.
Yes, and the VPPRN as well. Yes, yes, definitely. Okay, I think we've gone over time. So thank you for all the questions that were submitted. Thank you, Dr. Putman, for participating in this and leading us through this tour. This has been wonderful. And we're hoping that this tour is the first of many tours that we would be hosting for other research posters that we're doing. But we want to just sort of close by wanting to reiterate the importance of the engagement and the participation of the members of the Vasculitis Patient Powered Research Network. It is because of their engagement that we're able to do research studies. All the research studies that we went through today that Dr. Putman walked us through, that's all because of the Vasculitis Patient Powered Research Network. So we want to make sure that people understand how important it is and of being involved and just your continued engagement with us. So. And that's pretty much it. If you're not a member of the Vasculitis Patient Powered Research Network, we definitely join. Just type in vpprn.org in your browser. You'll read more about what VPPRN is, and you can sign up, join us in our journey to find answers for patients with vasculitis. And then I'll just do a little plug for the Trivial Pursuit game at the very end of our day today. So 8 p.m. Central. Hopefully everybody can join us. And I think that's it. So thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you again for Dr. Putman for joining us and leading us through this tour. And yeah, I think that's it. So have a great day.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate y'all.
Yeah, thanks.